أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين خاتم النبيين رحمة للعالمين بالقاسم محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المظلومين أما بعد فقد قال الله سبحانه وتعالى في كتابه المجيد وقوله الحق بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله حق تقاته ولا تموتن إلا وأنتم مسلمون صلوا على محمد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. We were talking yesterday about the connection through ethics, the human connection. And basically we talked of ethics in terms of the power of the inner to govern the outer behavior. How to discipline the soul so that it takes a certain coloring. In other words, what we call malaka. In order to train the soul to a certain mode of behavior, so much so that that virtue of a good behavior becomes automatic, that you do not even think about it, it becomes a part of you. I was also talking about how ethics is connected to faith, and because of that we cannot have a person who is religious if he or she is immoral. That is, religiosity and morality are deeply intertwined and connected. We cannot have an immoral God, and because of that, the laws of God, as I was saying, must also be moral. You cannot have a God who is moral and whose laws are immoral, for the simple reason that the laws of God reflect the Lord Himself. Just said a couple of, I forgot to turn it on, excuse me. A couple of quick pointers about ethics before we go into tonight's topic. That one of the points that we also need to understand, that we tend to think of jahl or jahil as a state of knowledge or lack of it. But in fact, Islamically, jahalat has nothing to do with lack of knowledge as much as it has more to do with lack of morality rather than lack of knowledge from the Quranic perspective. In other words, a person who may be a great scholar can still be a jahil. The reason why the Arabs were called jahiliya or jahil was simply because they had no sense of morality or of humanity. We've all heard about their behavior, how they used to bury their infants, how a person would even marry his father's wives. Jahalat in the Quranic understanding then is a lack of morality, a lack of moral awareness. It is because of this, by the way, that the Quran called the people of Lut as jahil. Not because they were ignorant or they were not learned, but because of immoral behavior. Similarly, if you'll recall, when Yusuf alayhi salam is about to be led to prison, فَإِن لَمْ تُسْتَرِفْ عَنِّي إِلَيْهِنَّ, if you had not turned me away from these ladies, أَسْبُ إِلَيْهِنَّ فَأَكُنْ مِنَ الْجَاهِلِينَ, then I might have gone towards them, then I, that is Yusuf, would have become a jahil. How can a prophet be jahil? If, God forbid, he had committed immoral behavior. So jahl then is lack of responsibility, moral responsibility. And in fact, jahl is used not as opposite to ilm, but it's used as opposite to hilm. There's a difference in ilm and hilm. Ilm is knowledge and hilm is proper moral behavior. The other point before we go to the next topic for tonight is that not only do we represent God as Khalifa of Allah, we are also supposed to reflect Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In other words, our behavior are an indication of how we actually activate and objectify the values that Allah has put within us. So, as the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam has himself said, थोड़ा ठंडा का salawat है. That's better. Adorn yourselves with the akhlaq of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because the more we reflect Him, the closer we get to Allah. So one of my students, and many a time, believe me, professors learn from the students rather than the other way around. It was actually Sheikh Vinay who wrote, he's writing a paper, by the way, on Dua Kumail. His thesis is on the Ziyarat and on Dua Kumail. And he said that Allah is not only merciful, but He has mercified His existence. We just recited Dua Kumail, if you recall the very first line, Allahumma inni as'aluka bi rahmatika allati wasi'at kulla shay. I ask you by your rahmah, which has encompassed, which has covered everything that you have created. So Allah has not only created us, but He has mercified His whole existence. And therefore, Imam Ja'far as-Sadiq alayhi salam says, know a believer, not by how many rak'ah he prays or she fasts, but also by how he or she behaves with the people. Because the akhlaqiyat, as I was saying yesterday, is deeply connected with our faith. What I want to do today is talk about authority. Because wherever there is institutions, whether it is religious institutions, even the spiritual response, there is some kind of authority. People who have authority and who guide, and sometimes misguide others also. People who make decisions. Authority, how do we define authority? The power or the right to give orders, make decisions, and enforce obedience. As a parent, you have authority over your children. So your boss has authority over you, and so on. We need to distinguish between power and authority. We tend to think of the two as similar, but they are not. Sometimes a person has power, but has no authority. Sometimes a person has authority, has no power, and sometimes he has both. What's the difference? People who come to power by force, for example, religious dictators, so they have the power, but authority depends on some kind of validation, justification of why that person is in authority. So for example, we believe that those who ruled the Muslim community after the Prophet, they had power, but they did not have authority. Because authority comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But only those who have been validated and appointed by Allah or the Prophet have the authority. So we recognize the first three caliphs' power, but we do not recognize their authority. The Imams, most of the time, they had authority, but they did not have power, because they were denied that political power. They may have had authority over us. We recognize them as being appointed by God, but apart from Imam Ali, and a few periods by Imam al-Hassan, they had no political power at all. See the difference between power and authority. There are different kinds of authority that we need to understand, so that we can see the difference between the spiritual and the institutional and the religious. There are different modes of authority. First of all, true authority, and authority is translated in Arabic as wilaya. True authority resides with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because He is the Lord. But since Allah does not come down on earth, He delegates His authority or gives His authority to His prophets. So the prophets have a special kind of authority. And what is this kind of authority? The prophetic authority is what is called charismatic or charisma. Does the term sound familiar to you? You may have heard says, this person is very charismatic. What does charisma mean? Many a time we use terms we don't quite understand, because it has a deep impact on us as human beings also. Charisma, the word charisma comes from the Greek goddess word charis, which personifies grace, beauty, purity, and altruism. A person who is charismatic may not even have the power, but because of something inside him and her, even women are charismatic also, they have the ability to attract others, ability to call others to a particular direction. And a person doesn't have to be a prophet, by the way, to be charismatic. How many cult-like figures have we seen in recent past who are able to attract people with their own form of charismatic power and charismatic authority? You remember David Koresh some time back in Waco, Texas? That man had enormous charisma to the extent that all of his followers in Waco, Texas, if you recall, in the 1990s, they were all killed. Even there was this guy called Jones in Guyana, I believe. Jimmy Jones, right? About 700-800 people committed mass suicide. Well, some of them were forced to drink poison. But these are just few examples of charismatic people who are able to demand and force obedience. For us, as far as the prophet is concerned, the prophet has an inner calling, which is a charismatic authority, but also based on the validation or appointment by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So it's not just any kind of charismatic authority. It's one which has an inner power which is validated by the divine. And therefore, because of that, apart from the personal calling, a prophet has to perform some kind of miracle. Because if he or she, or normally the prophet is a he, if the prophet does not commit any kind of miracle, then people may doubt regarding his true authority. So the authority of the prophet then was based on this charisma. From the Sunni point of view, I'm talking of Max Weber. Some of you who have studied sociology will know who I'm talking about. Max Weber says that after a charismatic figure, charisma is difficult to replicate. In other words, the disciples cannot have that same authority or charisma as the prophetic authority. So therefore, the office of charisma takes place. In other words, there's no one disciple who has the same charisma as the prophet. So the function of the prophet is then what we call routinized amongst the disciples. An office takes place. A group of people who perform the function of the prophet without having the same charisma as the prophet. This is the Sunni view of charisma authority after the prophet. However, the Shia view is slightly different. In fact, very different. We do not believe that any of the disciples had the same charisma, but their charisma was inherited by the close, those who were closely related to the prophet, namely Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam. So the Imams then inherit the charisma of the prophet. And therefore their authority is based on inherited charisma, or what we call hereditary charisma. And this charisma is based on the need to continue guidance to the people. The hereditary charisma that is based on divine appointment, but at the same time, by the way, we believe that there were three main traits, characteristics of the Imams. One was that he was divinely appointed. He had divinely inspired knowledge. He did not know everything, but there was extra knowledge given to the Imams that other human beings did not have. And the third main trait, apart from divine appointment and the knowledge, was also infallibility, which grants that charisma. The Imams themselves trained their disciples, and this was what we call the delegation of authority. That is, the Imams could not reach different cities at the same time. So they trained their disciples to reach out to different disciples in different parts of the Muslim world. So this is what we call appointment, knowledge, and the disciples did not have the ability to perform miracles. What we are essentially talking in now is that authority of the Imams being given to the disciples of the Prophet. Disciples like Zurara, Muhammad bin Muslim, and so on. And many a time, and I've proven this in my book, by the way, I wrote a book in 2006 called The Heirs of the Prophet. Many a time I'm introduced as having written a book on the hairs of the Prophet. There's a slight distinction between the heirs of the Prophet and the hairs of the Prophet. One is H-A-I-R-S, one is H-E-I-R-S. I wrote on the H-E-I-R-S, but people could not know how to pronounce hairs or heirs. In any case, in my book, and I'm not trying to promote it, I'm just trying to show you, I discuss how there was a distinction, sometimes differences, major differences between the disciples and the Imams. We find many a time the disciples disagreed with the Imams. Remember questions of interpretation and so on that we've discussed. During the ghaibat, and this is another form of authority now, was first we talked about charismatic authority, inherited authority, the authority of the Imams which was passed on to the disciples. Now what happens during the ghaibat? Because the Imam is no longer available. The ulama became the religious leaders of the community. In other words, they occupied or had authority. But their authority was a different kind. You see, there are different kinds of authority that we are talking of. It was what we call epistemic. Anytime you hear the word epistemology or epistemic, they're a big word, but basically it means knowledge. Authority based on their training in the particular field. Because when you are knowledgeable, you become authoritative also. When you have power, political power, you have authority. This is authority based on knowledge. In other words, based on the training, based on the knowledge of the sources, of the books, and interpretation. Whenever you interpret, you are able to pass your interpretation to others. However, it is important to note that initially, at least, the authority of the ulama was limited. We find that the authority of the ulama is much greater now than it was at the beginning, that is during the initial period of the ghaiba. The ulama, by the way, in the olden days, could not and would not accept khums either, unlike what we have today. In fact, what we were told in those days, that if you have the sahma imam, then you should bury it in the ground until the imam comes back. It was believed that when the imam comes, the Imam Sahu Zaman, the ground would open up and his whatever was in the ground would be his lawful property, that he could disperse it. Initially, at least, that was the ulama could not even declare jihad. Many of them, not all of them, believed that the ulama could not even lead Friday prayers. Their authority was restricted. We're talking the ulama's authority initially, was restricted to what is called umur al-hisbiyah, means social aspect. So for example, if you had a minor who was a yatim, somebody had to take care of their property. Who would do that? In the olden days, many a time it was the ulama. Or issues of differences within the community, of being a judge. And again, it was the ulama who would do that. So the authority of the ulama then was restricted to what the epistemic authority, in other words, what they were engaged in, which is interpretation of texts. Later on, by the way, the authority increased with time. The community came to rely on the transmission of the teachings of the imams, and the community became dependent on the interpretation of the scholars. And by the way, we should clear up one notion which many people misunderstand. Ijtihad initially was not allowed in Shia Islam. It is ironic that in the olden days it was the Sunnis who were doing the ijtihad, and our ulama said no, because ijtihad was defined differently in the olden days. It was more like personal reasoning without proper disciplinary principles. It was only in the 13th century that ijtihad was introduced in Shia Islam with a proper methodology, with a proper way of interpreting the sources. Sallu ala Muhammad wa alihi. So we've talked about different forms of authority, the charismatic authority of the Prophet. We talked of the authority inherited by the imams are passing their authority to their disciples, and the ulama's authority, which was initially restricted based on knowledge, based on the interpretation. However, the interpretation yielded different interpretations. Whenever you have scholars looking at a text, as we know now, this scholar says this way, another scholar says something different. Gradually, however, we find that the ulama's authority increased, so much so that they were able to shape and control the social and religious lives of the Shias. The authority then rests in Allah, in His prophets, in the imams, and in the books. Let's not forget, the Quran is authoritative for us because it is the book of God. Allah doesn't come down on earth, but it is the text itself which is representing the word of God. Whereas the ulama's authority was based on their interpretation of the text. However, things changed dramatically after the year 1501. 1501 was a pivotal year because it was in that year that Iran became Shia. Many a time you'll have heard many people say, oh, this Shiism was imported from Iran. People don't know what they're talking about. Because until the year 1501, Iran was predominantly Shia. It was certain areas which was it was Sunni, excuse me. I didn't get enough tea today. But it was up to 1501, Iran was predominantly Sunni. It was only after 1501 that it became Shia. The Safavid Empire took over, and in order to oppose the Ottomans in Turkey, they adopted Shia Islam. So in fact, it was during this period that the Shias persecuted the Sunnis in Iran. They drove them out. Sometimes they were forcibly converted. And what the Shias did in Iran was to import the ulama from Jabal Amir, what is Lebanon, from Iraq, in order to train the masses. And we find that now the authority of the ulama increased, especially because at times the scholars became more powerful than the kings and the shahs. They became more socially and politically active at that time. Many a time, by the way, we find that some people say that ulul amr, remember the very famous verse in the Quran, Ati'u Allah wa Rasul wa ulil amr minkum, that obey God, obey the Prophet, and those in authority. And people say, well, those in authority refer to the ulama. Most of the ulama says no. That ulul amr refers to the imams, not to the scholars. But in Safavid Iran, in the 16th century, 17th century, we find that many a time the ulama were actually presiding over the accession of the Shah. When the Shah came to power, who was who was supervising it? It was the ulama, Mir Damad, for example, a famous Gnostic. You must have heard of Allama Majlisi, huh? Allama Majlisi died in 1699. When Shah Sultan came to power, it was Allama Majlisi who exceeded or who supervised his coronation. There was a term called Mullah Bashi, not Mullah Bashing though, remember that. Mullah Bashi, not Bashing. We've been accused of that enough. Mullah Bashi basically means that what we may call today the Grand Ayatollah, although this term did not exist. In other words, the top of the ulama. And at that time, it was Allama Majlisi. What is also interesting that increased authority by the ulama based on their interpretation of the text and based on their increasing performance and activism in the Shia community led to increase in titles. Titles, people often ask me, where did these titles come from? Ayatollah, Hujjatul Islam, and so on. The more ulama you have, the more titles you need, because you need to distinguish. Even in the academic field, we have adjunct professor, my daughter here will call it adjunct professor, then we had associate or assistant professor, associate and full professor, and so on. So even the professors are divided. The ulama came to be divided too. You look at in the early period, for example, you've heard of Sheikh Tulaini, Tusi, Mufid. You never hear of them be called ayatollahs. They were called sheikh. Today, anybody who wears a kanzu here is called a sheikh. Huh? But in those days, sheikh meant somebody who was prominent, who was a real scholar. Even Sharif al-Murtada, who was a great scholar himself, he was called Sharif because he was Sayyid. But otherwise, their titles were mainly sheikh. When you look at people like Hilli, Allama Hilli, who was a great scholar, and the biggest title that he got was Allama. Today, a person who was teaching me, for example, Arabic in Qom is now called an Ayatollah in America. It's amazing how these titles have cheapened, unfortunately. So Allama was a great title applied to great scholars, but today there has so many Allamas around. Majlis is called Allama. Majlis was also called Shaykhul Islam. One of the other points that we need to also understand that Naibul Imam was not there before Shahid al-Thani. Shahid al-Thani lived in the 16th century. It was only then that this title was applied to him. The term Hujjatul Islam that we hear so often was actually used in the 19th century first. It was never used before then. It was used by an alim called Shafti, who was actually a pretty rich alim. We think that alims are all, ulama are all poor. He was well-to-do, believe me. He died in 1844, but for the first time we hear the title that he was called Hujjatul Islam. And then also we have ayatullahs, which came basically around the same period. But when you have too many ayatullahs, you have to distinguish between them too. And hence, during the time of Ayatollah Burujardi, many of you will remember that, he died in 1961, 62. That's why you have the term title Ayatollah al-Udhma onwards, because there were too many ayatollahs. So therefore, the authority of the jurist was increased in the very sources that he was interpreting. Sallu ala Muhammad. So one more salawat, please. The authority went beyond then sacred figures and sacred texts. It also incorporated human reasoning. In other words, the fact that they were interpreting the sources using their own akal meant that they became authoritative. To sum up that, and we will now go on to spiritual authority and see how that impacts us. Authority rested in the past, that is the prophets, and also in the scholars, the ulama, due to their expertise in that particular subject. I'm also asked many a time, and I have to tell you this, because this is just an FYI, but people ask it, therefore we have to say the truth. This idea that if you don't do taqleed, all your amal is batil, that only comes about in the 20th century, not before then. Around the 20th century, we hear this based on their interpretation, the understanding that in order for your acts to be valid, you have to be emulating a proper figure. So, we want to talk of a different kind of authority. We have talked about the authority of the scholars, the authority of the ulama, the authority of the prophet, the authority of the institutionalized religion. But even in spirituality, there is authority. And the imams are included in this too. Because we believe that the imams were not just any ordinary figures, they were holy figures. And you hear this term holy a lot these days, don't you? I don't know, everything is holy. You have holy prophet, and you have, I don't know, holy cow, and I don't know, Holy Spirit, and even the woods and the forests in Los Angeles have become holy these days. They call it Hollywood. Hollywood. Anyway, what do we mean by the term holy? Holy refers to the source or object of religious veneration. In other words, anything which is connected with Allah in one form or another, for us becomes holy because of a connection with the metaphysical, beyond the physical. So holiness then is extended to include the attributes of people, actions, and anybody or anything which is somehow connected with the divine in one form or another. Holiness is like a moment of spiritual encounter. And this is an important point, that a spiritual encounter makes a person holy. And that becomes, has major repercussions on how we see other figures. The characteristics of the holy figure then is a state of holiness. That he, and normally it's a he, but it can also be a she, has such mystery, of such intensity, that when you look at that person, you are overawed. You are captivated. And you may have seen some certain people who, by their very appearance, give that sign of sanctity, of holiness. So, holiness can occur in many things, in many ways. The authority of the holy person then occurs because of his access to the supernatural. But that person who is engaged in this holy authority, if you like, is based on certain things. Not just anybody can come and claim or even seen as a holy figure. Many times because he, and as I say, can also be a she, is engaged in personal spiritual activities, ranging from asceticism, which is zuhd, that is to discipline the soul, self-denial, and so on. These are some of the requirements of attaining closeness to the divine and attaining a state of holiness. One of the important elements in this is what we call spiritual modeling. A person who is holy, whose authority has to be based on certain things. One of them is spiritual modeling. What do we mean by spiritual modeling? It means that you model yourself on the Prophet, not only in terms of what he did what he did not do, what he said. These are all part of modeling. But spiritual modeling is more than that. It is actually modeling yourself on the spiritual states of the Prophet and the Imams. In other words, trying to experience Allah the way that the Prophet and the Imams experience Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to exemplify the inner and outer traits of them. So spiritual modeling then became an important way of prophetic paradigm, of authority of the holy person, to experience the spiritual state of the Prophet, to exemplify his inner and outer act. In many ways, then imitation became an important way of getting the modeling of the Prophet. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ala. There is another element of what we may call biological lineage. In other words, authority-based, holy authority now, based not only spiritual modeling, but also biological lineage. In other words, and no disrespect here to anybody, please, so don't take it personally, is what we call Sayyid. We have all heard about them. Sayyids are those who it is believed that the charisma of the Prophet is believed to have been transmitted through the progeny, through the family of the Prophet, and that the charisma is available in holy people because of their biological connection to the Prophet. Not because they are spiritually modeling, not because they are really holy, but because they are Sayyids. So that has become a very important method or source of authority in the Islamic community. In fact, Sayyids became very powerful figures in many cultures in different times. And this, by the way, extends to all cultures, not just to Shia Islam. You may have heard of Sayyids even in Arab culture or African culture. Who is Sayyid? You know, somehow he has extra authority. It is believed that even if he smacks you, you say, Alhamdulillah, Sayyid smacked me. That kind of thing. The people became very, very somehow they saw these Sayyids as holy figures. Because Sayyids, in many instances, many cultures, whether it is religious or not is a different issue, by the way. Religiously, they do not have the same kind of authority that they have culturally. But they are believed to be certain of divine forgiveness. And one point that also needs to be clarified, because I'm asked so many times, this distinction between black and white. Why is it that Sayyids wear black turbans and non-Sayyids wear white? Well, for your information, for our information, this only emerged in the 18th or 19th century. The Imams wore different kinds and color of turbans. We hear of Imam Ali wearing a yellow turban, for example. Sometimes he'd wear green. The Prophet ﷺ used to wear red turbans, white turbans, different kinds of turbans, colored turbans. Although on important occasions, the Prophet did wear black also. When he coronated Imam Ali for Ghadir, he put on a black turban. So at that time, it was a different kind, different colored turbans. And in those days, I think it's important for us to understand, in those days, turbans was a national costume. Just like you go to Afghanistan today, every Changu Mangu is wearing a turban there, right? Does that mean that they are somehow authoritative figures? No, because it's a national costume. The way that, we wear some of those caps, baseball caps, the other way around, many youths do wear it. It did not connote anything special. It was only later on that somehow turbans became a symbol only for scholars. As I said, the Imams wore different colored turbans, and also, interestingly, I wrote an article on this recently. I came up with these rather funny looking titles. It was called Black or White, the Turbanization of Shia Islam. It has been published. But the Imams also wore turbans with what they call Tahtul Hanak. Tahtul Hanak means, you may have seen some ulama when they are leading the prayers, a part of their turbans is left dangling and it's around the neck. In the olden days, our Imams and our scholars always wore, not just during the prayer time, they wore the turbans with one part hanging around their necks. There are hadith which the ulama themselves transmit from the Imams that whoever wears a turban should also tie a turban, part of the turban around his neck. Because if he does not do so, he will be inflicted with such an ailment and a disease for which there is no cure for. Absolutely, I've seen those hadiths, and but it was abandoned later on, by the way, around the 15th, 16th century. That idea of tying a turban around your neck was abandoned for the simple reason it was called libas al-shuhra. Libas al-shuhra means that when you wear a certain mode of clothing, that people start laughing at you, then people start mocking at you, then you should not wear that. For whatever reason, culturally, historically, people started mocking at those scholars who were wearing tahtul hanak. And therefore it was said that you should not wear that. But there are some who still do that, whether not only in prayers, but even after prayers, they still wear a portion of they tie their portion of their turban out, over their neck. Sallu ala Muhammad wa alihi. There is also another form of authority which impacts us, all of us, in one form or another, which is the authority of barakah. You've heard all the term barakah many times. Barakah refers to the divine grace that is given to certain people. And especially in popular culture, the barakah comes in different ways. In acts, in certain actions. When somebody gets married, what do we say? Mubarak. Why? Because we believe that act of union has been blessed. There's barakah in marriage itself. In days, in months, in numbers, in places, and so on. Even the month of Ramadan, in a month, is called what? Mah Mubarak. The month which is blessed has gotten certain blessing from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. According to the Quran, even the olive tree, you remember that surah number 24, Shajaratun Mubarakatun Zaytunatun, the blessed olive tree. So even the olive tree is got barakah. The barakah of the holy person then is transmitted, because we do believe that holy people have certain barakah which gives them authority. The barakah is seen in the cloak, in the clothes that they wear. So often we find that people will go and even just kiss the cloak of an alim. Haven't you seen that? Not only when he puts it over his hand, but even when he's walking, people will go and kiss his abba and kaba. Nobody does that to me, unfortunately. But we often do that in order to acquire some barakah. Somehow, even if that person is not holy, the cloth becomes holy. So you find people go and touch and kiss the barakah. Sometimes people feel that just touching and shaking or even kissing the hand of the holy person can also see the transmission of barakah. The barakah is also transmitted through descent, as we have seen. In other words, through sacred lineage, the Sayyids also. Because the Sayyids are believed not only to have received the charisma through the biological factor, but they also have the barakah of the Prophet. Now this is purely cultural. Whether they have it religiously or not is a different issue, and many people would not agree to that. But barakah goes beyond the living. It also goes to the saint and the shrine of the saint. You'll see now how authority is spread in Islam. It's from the Prophet to the imams, to the scholars who interpret the text, to the text themselves, to the holy person, to their clothes, and even now also to their graves. Because barakah is located, it is believed, at the location of a saint. You find this in Shia Islam for sure, and also in Sufi Islam, because it transformed the divine energy into mundane ones. In other words, to experience the holiness, you have to go through different modes, whether it is to the Prophet himself or to the grave of an imam. Barakah, the holiness, is a combination. Conflation is combination of sacred genealogy, of inherited barakah, of charisma, of personal asceticism, and the effects of barakah. And we have all experienced this in one way or another. That in order to fulfill your desires, your hajat, you have to go through a holy figure. You'll be surprised that many people feel that because a person is an alim, he has extra access to Allah. He does not right away. because Allah listens to everybody. He doesn't listen to an alim specially because he's an alim. Allah listens to everybody, provided we go with a clear heart, with a clear conscience. But the effects of barakah in many societies is that you fulfill desires. For many people, the barakah of a saint will protect against disease, avert calamities, and so on. The miracles are seen as the best expression of the supernatural abilities of a holy person. We find that miracles play a very important role, by the way, in the authority. Many times, whether it is the Sufi saints or holy figures, exhibit their authority through miracles themselves. Miracles become a vital component in the recognition of an imam or of a saint. Miracles show in a very clear way that the holy person has actually experienced what is called the holy itself. The power of the holy person, holy man, is conceived then in terms of knowledge, in terms of the power of miracles, which influence and touch the lives of ordinary people. Sallu ala Muhammad wa alayhi. So far then, we have talked of different kinds of authority in different kinds of people. I want you to see how that impacts what the institutionalized religion and the spiritualized religion. Any form of religion that you may take, there is authority. People who exercise authority, sometimes they use and even abuse authority itself. The men of the Sharia, I call them Shar'i men, those who are looking at texts, mainly books, they derive their authority from the Prophet, the knowledge, and on the text. And by the way, there is a very famous hadith. The book that I was telling you about, The Heirs of the Prophet, is based on a hadith from the Prophet. Al-ulama warathatul anbiya. That the ulama are the inheritors of the Prophet. And that tradition, by the way, is used by the Shias, by the Sunnis, by the philosophers, by the Sufis. Everybody wants to appropriate that particular form of authority. The holy man then was the heir to the Prophet, and he claims to the spiritual authority of the Prophet because of his spirituality. Other persons were heirs to the Prophet based on the genealogical link, that is the biological link, or duplicated the spiritual journey of the Prophet. In all of this, even the shrines, and we go to Karbala, we go to Najaf, we go to shrines because there is a relationship between the holy man and the people and the holy places, because it is believed that the barakah is located in that shrine. We visit the shrine to experience the barakah of that holy person. And why? Because it enhances us in our spiritual path, giving us some of that holiness to us. It was interesting that last year I went to Multan. Many of you may have been to Multan in Pakistan. And there are many, many shrines there of local Sufis. And I went to this particular shrine. To my amazement, there was somebody outside, just near the entrance to the shrine, and he was doing Naat, Naat, Ode or Qasida of Imam Ali. For many Sufis, the way to Allah is through Imam Ali. So even though they may not be Shias like us, for them, Imam Ali was a very, very spiritual figure. And therefore you'll find that they will always, whenever they trace their lineage to the Prophet, it goes through Imam Ali, not through any of the other caliphs, because Ali ibn Abi Talib was such a spiritual figure. Sallu ala Muhammad. The legacy of the holy man then is cultivated and perpetuated. In other words, it continues at the shrine, because the shrine becomes a focal point for getting the barakah and the personal experience of the holy man. Because it is believed that the charisma has been transferred to the shrine, even though he is dead. But the shrine has contained his charisma. It is here that the holy man is able to spread the barakah to his visitors. There are many rituals which are performed at the shrine. We don't need to go into details, but just one other point before I go to the Messiah. This is called translation. Translation doesn't mean what we tend to think of translation. It means that if you cannot go to get the barakah from the holy man, then it will come to you. In other words, you find that people go and use believe that the barakah is transferred from the shrine to the object and to the person. Now, how much of this is actually happening, it depends on your beliefs. But for the masses at least, this is a very potent and important source of authority, because barakah carries authority, blessings from Allah. So even if you cannot go to the shrine will come to you. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ala. Sallallahu alayka ya Aba Abdullah. Sallallahu alayka ya ibn Rasulillah. Ruhi wa jismi wa arwahul alameen laka al-fida. Ya gharib, ya madloom, ya shaheed bi ardi Karbala. We find that after Imam Hussein reached Karbala, he was always trying to find a way out, not to fight. And therefore Imam Hussein called Umar ibn Asad and explained to him if there can be a way to compromise, to go over the differences. And Umar ibn Asad in reality did not want to fight Imam Hussein. We hear that Imam Hussein and Umar ibn Asad sometimes would sit and talk until the middle of the night to see if a compromise could be reached. To the extent that Imam Hussein told Umar ibn Asad, don't ask me from the bay'ah. I will not fight against you. I will not create problems of you. Just let me go. I will even leave the Hijaz. I will go far away. But don't ask me for the bay'ah. Umar ibn Asad wrote to Ibn Ziyad. And he said, I think we can avert war here. Hussein has said very clearly that he will not create any problems for us as long as we do not demand the bay'ah from him. The letter from Ibn Ziyad, which was inspired by Shimr, was that I did not send you, O Umar ibn Asad, to Karbala for the sake of peace. Either the bay'ah of Hussein or his head. You have only two choices, either this or that. At that point, Imam Hussein said, Wallahi la yakunu dhalika abada. This will never ever happen, that I should give my hand in the hand of Yazid. Azadarani Hussein, there are so many lessons that we can learn from the events in Karbala. There's one inspiring lesson that I find, it is the importance of the salat. That how Hussein valued the salat even in the middle of the battlefield. As the battle is taking place, if you've been to Karbala, there's a place called Tilla Zainabiyya, you'll remember, where Imam Hussein would stand and he would watch the battle unfold in front of him. As he was standing there, a person comes to him. He says, Yabna Rasulillah, I see that death is approaching. And inshallah, I will give my life for you. I will die before you do. But I have just one wish. Imam Hussein turns to him. What can I do for you? Hussein doesn't have water, doesn't have food, he has nothing. Abu Thumama says, Yabna Rasulillah, I see that the time for prayer has approached. My only wish is to pray behind you. Imam Hussein's face glowed at that time. And he says, Kad zakarta salata ya Abu Thumama. You have remembered the prayers, O Abu Thumama. Ja'alaka Allahu min al-musallin al-dhakirin. May God make you amongst those who have remembered the prayers. Tell them, O Abu Thumama, that we want to pray. But they were not even allowed to pray in peace. As Hussein and his companions were leading and were praying, this was not even the Dhuhr prayer. This was a special prayer, Salatul Khawf, the prayer of fear. But there was one person called Sa'id bin Abdullah al-Hanafi. He would guard Imam Hussein. While Hussein was praying, the enemies were firing arrows, spears at Hussein. Sa'id would take them on his chest. He would shield Imam Hussein. When Hussein finished his prayer, Sa'id fell on the ground. Hussein goes up to him and Sa'id opens his eyes on the verge of death. And he said, Awafaytu yabna Rasulillah, have I been successful? Have I fulfilled my ambition? Have you finished your prayer? Because if you have prayed, then I have been successful. Azadar and Hussein, we find so many noble companions of Hussein giving their lives and wishing and praying to give their lives for Hussein. One of them was Nafi bin Hilal. Who was Nafi? A person living in Kufa. Another Hafiz of Quran. He, that is Nafi, had fought with Imam Ali at both Siffin and the Battle of Jamal. And he joined Imam Hussein on the way to Karbala. Before Hussein reached Karbala, Nafi joined Hussein. Hur actually objected at that point. He told Imam Hussein that he cannot join you, Nafi cannot join you. You are only allowed to take people who came with you. At that time there was an altercation between Imam Hussein and Hur. Finally, Hur accepted. When they had reached Karbala, one of the people who tried to get water even before the day of Ashur with Hazrat Abbas was this Nafi. When Nafi went to the river, the people objected, but somebody told Nafi, Hajjaj told him that you can have water, but just do not take it back to the camp. Nafi said, no. If Hussein and the children do not drink water, Nafi will not drink water. Nafi was a great and expert horseman. He came to the battlefield. Such an expert horseman that he killed many with his arrows. The only way that they could actually defeat Nafi was to cut off both of his hands. They actually disempowered him. Nafi was captured and was brought in front of Umar ibn Sa'ad. Umar ibn Sa'ad said, what did you do, O Nafi? And he said that I killed many of your people and I wounded many of them. And if I had my hands, I would have killed even more. And then Umar ibn Sa'ad turns to Shimr, says, oh Shimr, you can do whatever you want with him. Shimr, he puts his spears in Nafi. Nafi dies right in front of Umar ibn Sa'ad. Azadarana Hussein. There are many, many companions, noble companions of Hussein. But one of the most inspiring one I find is Muslim bin Awsaja. Muslim, a 70-year-old man. 70 years old. He comes to Imam Hussein on the day of Ashur and he goes to give his life. The importance of a Muslim is that he was a noble companion of the Prophet himself. He remembered how close Hussein was to the Prophet himself. Muslim was the one who had conquered Azerbaijan in the year 644. When Muslim comes to the battlefield, they surround him. Muslim falls on the ground, and as he falls on the ground, he's rolling on the ground. Hussein goes running to Muslim. Muslim at that point, Muslim says to Hussein, I want to do a wasiyah. Hussein says, oh Muslim, what wasiyah can you do for me? He says, I do not want to do a wasiyah for you. I want the wasiyah to be done to Habib. Call Habib here. Habib goes to Muslim. Oh Muslim, what can I do for you? Muslim is on the verge of death. Muslim points to Imam Hussein and he says, oh Habib, do not leave him alone. Make sure that when Hussein dies, you should die before him. The final episode that I wish to recite tonight is of two young boys. These were the children of Zainab, the children of Abdullah ibn Ja'far. Abdullah sent not only Zainab, but his two sons, Aun and Muhammad. On the eve of Ashur, Zainab gathers her two sons and she tells her sons, oh my sons, oh Aun and oh Muhammad, tomorrow I want you to sacrifice your lives for your uncle. On the day of Ashur, Zainab calls her children and tells them that, are you ready now for the battlefield? Aun and Muhammad comes to Imam Hussein. They come to Hussein. Hussein says, have you asked your mother? They said that our mother is the one who asked us to come and give our lives for you. Aun and Muhammad go to the battle with these two young brothers. The army split them apart. They are scattered in different directions. At one point, Aun falls. Then Muhammad falls. Hussein, he goes running after Aun. And he calls his own disciples and companions, oh my companions, come and gather the bodies of these two young children. When Hussein and his companions, when they bring the bodies of Aun and Muhammad, you know what Zainab does? She does not cry over them. She goes into sajda and she says, oh my Lord, accept my sacrifices for Hussein. Ala la'natullahi al-qawmi al-zalimin, sayalamu alladhina kafaru. Mata min Hussein.